In tonight's edition of The Issue, 18C and free speech, the issue that just doesn't go away. The government's changes may have been defeated in the Senate, but the issue's not going anywhere. Simon Breheny is the director of the Legal Rights Project at the IPA. They, of course, have been pushing this issue for a long time. And Jeremy Jones is from the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, AJAC. Welcome to both of you.
G'day, good to be with you.
Good evening.
The changes were voted down but are now Liberal Party policy. Is this a battleground at the next in the next election, Jeremy?
It's going to be very interesting to see what happens. The way this legislation was introduced to the Senate rather than the House of Representatives tends to indicate that there was an expectation that it was going to be a tough battle to get it through. Better to not have a debate in the House of Representatives, not put your people in the front line, because that might reflect badly in individual electorates. Whether or not this is an issue that's going to excite people generally, though, I think we have to deconstruct it. There's the issue of racism in Australia, and I think, as we would say, most people in the debate don't want there to be racism in Australia. The question is how you deal with it. Then there's the issue of the balance with free speech, with, again, everyone speaking in the debate emphasised the importance of free speech, but said you have to get a balance with protections or recourse for victims of racism. Whether or not that's going to be something which excites the minds of either of the main parties or any of the other parties when it comes to the election, I think it's very difficult to say at this point.
But, Jeremy, is it something you would campaign on during the election? You've been worried about some of these changes. Is it something that you will be letting voters know in some of those crucial seats that they shouldn't be supporting, that the Liberal Party's putting out a policy potentially that you don't support?
It's really a matter that there is a debate, as you said. There has been a debate about the value of the particular laws, their strength in dealing with a particular problem. If we're going to have a debate about what is the best way to deal with racism, that's one thing. If we're going to have a debate which says the importance of protection of racism is not seen as such an important responsibility of government anymore, I think then we've got that different sort of debate. From where I'm coming from, I've been consistent, as have many other people, and that is, we don't say the law's perfect, but we say until a better proposition is put, we think it would be a bad thing to fiddle with it and change it. I think one of the problems for the government, though, in the debate in the Senate, were the optics did not look good, because no matter what was behind the government's move, there was a feeling in many quarters, and it was ventilated everywhere, that this really was weakening the legislation and weakening protections. And for a government to go to the election, to go to the battlefield saying what we're offering you as a protection against racism is weakening your protection is definitely not going to help them.
Simon, are you satisfied with this policy to take it to the election? I know the IPA would like the government to go further, but is this satisfactory?
Well, I think that the best protection for freedom of speech is to repeal Section 18C in its entirety, and the IPA has been pretty consistent along those lines for a long time now. We'll continue to campaign on those issues. We'll keep doing the research and advocacy on those issues that we've always done. I think that it's a great policy. I think that the policy of the current coalition government is a good one. They now have to stick to it, and good on them for having the guts to take on all of those who think that Section 18C is an appropriate law, that think it's appropriate that it should be unlawful to offend and insult someone, even on the basis of race. I think good on them for sticking up for freedom of speech, because a lot of coalition supporters were out there thinking, well, is the coalition serious about freedom of speech? How far will they go with this reform? And frankly, I think that it's good that they've gone as far as they did to remove, or to propose to remove, the words offend, insult and humiliate, and to add back in the word harass, because really what it does is it raises that threshold and makes it much more appropriate about physical acts rather than words, rather than speech. So I think this is a good policy, and I'd be surprised if they did anything other than take it to the next election. So I think that's a wonderful thing for freedom of speech.
Simon, do you accept that it'll be very contentious in some of those electorates? I know about 7 marginal electorates have been identified as places where this does energise people enough to the point where they don't support it. You might be a supporter, but there are many people who feel like this will violate their rights.
Look, I don't think so. The job of anyone to get elected to Parliament is to make sure that you get at least 50% plus one of the electorate. You're never going to convince 100% of the people who are voting for you to vote for you rather than the others that are putting their hand up. So the reality is, of course, that there are people in the Greens, there are people who vote Labor, there are others in the community who don't like these changes, but they're never going to vote for the coalition anyway. So the politics of this are pretty simple. I think that to say that there are swing voters in seats in Western Sydney is one of those areas that's talked about a lot, who are going to change their vote on this very middle of the road, very modest piece of legislation which is about protecting freedom of speech, I think, frankly, is a bit of a furphy. I think the reality is that there are going to be far more coalition supporters that are going to be energised by the fact that the coalition is standing up for a core right that they see as being incredibly important to living in a liberal democracy.
Jeremy, you heard the language from Simon there, middle of the road kind of reform. Is it just a middle of the road reform?
Well, the first language I heard from Simon was his view that the best thing would be to repeal the law altogether. And in my discussions, there are people who are very committed to repealing the law altogether, and they stand for something. They're not... they represent a point of view that I don't agree with, but it's consistent and clear, and that's what they say. And I think that's where the government, in a sense, has itself in a bit of a mess, because the message they're putting out is not that they have suddenly adopted the idea that might appeal to some people who are very ideologically committed in one area to repeal the law altogether. What they've done is they've fiddled with it. And the symbolism of that fiddling with the law or proposing something which they did not sell very well to anybody, as far as I can see, as an improvement, but as an adjustment. They've proposed this adjustment without being able to push it very convincingly before any of the people who went in doubting it in the first place. That's one issue. But the second issue is people are asking already what would have been the practical effect. Now, there was a hearing by a joint parliamentary committee. I was fortunate enough to be invited, as were many others, to speak before that committee. Myself and my colleague, Dr. Rubenstein from Melbourne, were given an hour basically by the committee, who really wanted to know how the law was working at the moment and to hear some of the cases and some of the matters which had been discussed and considered under the existing law. And what we heard from the committee members is they would not have liked a different result in any of the cases that I brought before them. These were amongst many of the complaints that have been brought under the law, including some cases which have gone to the federal court. And with the changing to the law, the government now has to say, how is it that they're happy overwhelmingly with the results of the law, but they want to change it in a way which would bring about an element of uncertainty? That's not going to convince anybody.
Well, you've heard that, Simon, that it's an unconvincing position, that they've tinkered with the law. One thing that they have passed, and I'd just like to cover the part that's actually now law, is, of course, changes to the procedure itself. Simon, are you confident that will make some changes, I mean, that will actually help your cause, that cases like Bill Leakes may be much less likely to sort of get any traction under these changes?
Yeah, look, there's something to be said for improving any law, and whether it's 18C or anything else, I encourage the government to continue to pursue those changes. The reality about changes to Section 18C made under the bill that was passed by the Senate is that they don't go anywhere near far enough to resolve all of the problems that have been identified. There's no stopping a Bill Leak case or a QUT case or columnists being taken before the federal court under the changes that were made. Some of those processes might be made a bit quicker, but frankly I think the fact that we are still likely to see cases like this is going to mean that there will be further outcry in years to come about cases such as these. And look, frankly, if Xenophon is right, he was one of those that said, look, let's have a look at this law after these process changes have been made. If he's right and we don't see any more of these cases, then terrific. I think that's a great thing, because
Will you give up this then, if it's terrific and it shows that it's fixed whatever problem you've diagnosed?
Well, I can't see that it will fix the problem, and to some extent we'll never know. I mean, there's always that chilling effect where you don't need cases to come before the Human Rights Commission or the Federal Court for people's speech to be infringed. But look, you know, if that does happen and over the next 20 years we don't see another one of those controversial cases, then I think that's a good thing. But I still think it's highly problematic to have on the books a law that makes it unlawful to offend or insult someone.
Jeremy, final word to you. Given it is now coalition policy and it looks very unlikely that they'll change it again before the next election, does your job become one of trying to ensure that parties like Nick Xenophon's and a few of the other crucial players in all of this hold the line, that the government is just unable to get this through the parliament that we see?
I think it's a little bit more complex than that. Well, first of all, there is the matter of the parties that are currently opposed to the law, who currently want to keep the law as it is. Yes, there will be the issue of constantly discussing with them if the law is working, if it's not working, how it can be made better, but why it is very important that we don't have a situation, particularly in a time of global uncertainty, where there's an optics coming from government which says your rights to be protected from racism are not something which our government is taking as seriously as it did previously. When it comes to within the government, though, I'm sure there's going to be ongoing discussion. If you look at the committee which heard this, the Joint Parliamentary Committee, the members of the Liberal Party, and so from the government, within the committee, were not of one view. There are different views within the Liberal Party. There are different views within the coalition about the priority of this issue and how it can be carried. My job, as I see it, is to make sure that there's a general awareness of the importance within our community of people who are victims of racism, who are having their human rights taken away, have some sort of recourse against that. At the same time, I believe very strongly that as much free speech as possible should be also supported. So I will be continuing to advocate for the sort of balance we have with the current laws. And as Simon says, and as Nick Xenophon and others have said, we do have to look at the reforms to the process to see how well they go towards solving the problem, because I agree 100% with Simon. No law is perfect. Every law can be improved. In this particular case, though, what the government put did not convince the majority of the Senate that it would be an improvement in getting that balance right, that important balance, protecting freedoms of speech and protecting people who have been the victims of racism.
Thank you to both of you. It's an interesting conversation. It's been interesting for years and it continues to be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.